Hey there. I'm Della Rucker. I'm the principal of the Wise Economy Workshop, and I'm so glad you're able to join me today to talk about the future ready mindset, which is part of my whole area of work around future readiness. When people ask me what I do, I sometimes say I'm an urban planner and economic developer because those are categories that I fall into. But really, my work is about being an applied local futurist. Yeah, I made up that term. What I mean by applied local futurism is that my focus is on figuring out and understanding how our present and our future, the future that is unfolding right now, how those are going to be so profoundly different from our past, from the world that a lot of us grew up in. And I focus within that on developing the skills and the mindsets and the structures that we all need to have in order to thrive in a world that is already becoming and will become more and more and more different from our past. If you like what you hear here today, you can engage with me in a couple of different ways. We stream here every Thursday at noon Eastern time. And in addition to that, we post a lot of content on LinkedIn and on Instagram and on a lot of the other places where you're accustomed to finding content. I also have a newsletter, which is called Future Here and Now. And Future Here and Now focuses on tools and techniques and understanding for individuals, for businesses and organizations, and for communities that are trying to live and work in a future ready manner. So you can find that newsletter at wiseeconomy.substack.com. And just remember that you can check out an article for free anytime, and you can get a week free when you sign up for a subscription. It's a very good deal. So we wanted to talk a little bit today about this idea of a future ready mindset. So it's the beginning of the year. A lot of us are in a moment or have been in a moment where we're kind of focusing on how do I need to reorganize or reboot or improve how I live. And if you're like me, you find 9 times out of 10 that process is incredibly difficult. And that before you know it, you've fallen back into the same situation, the same practices, the same habits that you did before. And if it's that hard to change our mindset when it comes to something relatively concrete, like our exercise habits or our eating habits or visiting our friends or something like that, you begin to get a sense of how much more difficult it is to build a future ready mindset, a future ready mental set of mental patterns. So that's what we're going to be talking about on this platform, on these lives, in a lot of the content that you see from me, and especially on the Future Here Now newsletter. So that newsletter will give you some good resources for continuing on that journey. And from my perspective, the work we do on ourselves is just a first step. We have to work on ourselves in order to be able to have the same kind of impact on our organizations, our teams, our businesses, and ultimately on our communities. because our communities have more impact than any one of us by ourselves will ever have. So that's going to be the focus for this whole month. And it's a subject that's kind of hard to talk about. It's abstract, like mindset. What is a mindset? Mind can be a hard idea for us to get our heads around. In fact, one of the books that I recommend, and you can find the whole list at wiseeconomy.com, books and good stuff, is a book called The Mind and the Brain, which is it's close to 30 years old now. But it was one of the first books that really laid out the research basis and did it in a way that regular people could understand of how we can actually change our mindsets. And a lot of the self-improvement content that we have around us anymore finds its germination in that idea of being able to change your mindset. But it's still hard to talk about, especially for people like I would bet a lot of you are, who are let's get stuff done kind of people. You don't want to sit around and contemplate your navel or, pontificate. You're out there to get something done. You're out there to make an impact and make a difference. So all of this stuff about, mindsets and mental frameworks and whatever, it can sound a little frustrating, a little off-putting, because you want to go out and just get the thing done. But it's unbelievably crucial for us to focus on our own mindsets first. Not just about what we're consciously thinking about, but about our assumptions, our expectations, our systems of expectations that a lot of times we're not even thinking about consciously. And we're going to talk about that today. But the reason why mindset is so important is because we can so easily do an activity, do the work that we need to be doing, and have all the right intentions, but be doing it in a way that doesn't align with the situation that we're actually working with. And it's because our brains go into old thinking patterns, old assumptions, old expectations. That's part of why so many of our New Year's resolutions aren't panning out right now. It's because we haven't put in the systems in our own brains to make that change stick. So if you're interested in building a future-ready organization or business or community, you got to start with this thing. So let's talk a little bit. I've got some notes over here to the side. When I framed up this session today, I started talking about VUCA. We live in a VUCA world. And in some of the text around that, I spelled out what VUCA is an acronym for. In some places I did. But if I take a minute and explore that premise, that'll set us up with a stronger understanding, a stronger sort of foundational understanding of why it is that mindset change is so crucial, not just in general, but at this moment in human development, in our economic history, in the life of our communities and organizations and ourselves. So what does VUCA mean? VUCA. It's a military term. It came out of military strategy. And it was an identification of environments that were volatile, I'm looking over here to make sure I get the words right. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So let's break those down for a second. A volatile situation is one that can change potentially and often change in problematic or troubling ways very quickly. So that's a volatile situation. As I'm recording it, we've got horrible, as I'm recording and doing this live, we're having horrible wildfires in Los Angeles. And folks that I know and love are being, have been displaced and in some cases are losing their homes. That's about as volatile an environment as we can imagine. Uncertain kind of spells it out for itself. When something is uncertain, obviously we don't know what it's going to do or what's going to happen. The second two terms in that VUCA framing, I think, are really fascinating. Complex and ambiguous. So when something's complex, there's a difference between complexity and complicated, right? I think most of us can probably drudge this up out of the back of our heads from college or high school or something. If something is complicated, it has a lot of moving pieces. It has a lot of elements that all have to fit together. But something that is complicated, that term implies that they fit together in a particular way. And when they fit together that way, the thing works. Something that is complex also has a whole lot of moving pieces, parts, but it's not so clear how they can or should fit together. We used to think of physics, for example, as a complicated system. Lots of rules, lots of characteristics, lots of things that could happen, but in a predictable manner. And the more we get into our understanding of quantum physics, the more the idea of that element of predictability that the term complicated implies, the more that goes out the window. So a complex situation is one that has a lot of moving pieces and parts, and you don't really know how they're going to fit together. And then the fourth term that I laid out there is ambiguous. And ambiguous, for a lot of us, is the hardest one to accept or get our heads around at all. Because if a situation is ambiguous, that means that it's not clear whether there's a right or a wrong answer, or what that right or wrong answer is. If it's ambiguous, we may not even know what the boundaries are. We might not know what the classifications, all of the things that we use to understand a situation and shape our understanding of a situation. If it's ambiguous, we lose a lot of those tools and structures that we rely on. So we live in a world that is VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So when the military uses that term, they're talking about a specific context. But my argument to you is that we're at a moment in history, all of us, where an old system of doing things, I usually shorthand it as the Industrial Revolution. The industrial era is coming to a close. And what comes next? Well, there's this transitional period, and there's been transitional periods every time that human existence has made these kinds of transitions. When we moved from being agricultural, a predominantly agricultural culture to an industrial culture, when we moved from hunting and gathering to agriculture, those were massive shifts. And in fact, the World Economic Forum calls that moment that we're in right now the fourth industrial revolution. Kind of makes sense. You have to know what the previous three were, and most people only know of one. But going back through all of human history, the point being, we're in one of these transitional periods where the basic structures and systems, the kind of core underpinnings of how the world works, are changing. They've already changed a lot. They've changed a lot very quickly. And there's more of that changing to come. We don't exactly know what the world is going to look like on the other side of this, but we can be pretty confident that the world on the other side of this VUCA period that we're in is going to look pretty different from the world that most of us have come up in to one extent or another, which is the closing years of the industrial era. So that means that we're in a moment right now, we're in a period of history right now where it's really hard to predict. It's extraordinarily difficult to plan ahead, because the environment in which we live, not just in terms of disasters, but in terms of the very basic ways that people work and think and work together, those are all changing very profoundly and very deeply. And we'll get into more of that in future lives. So we're in a period of VUCA. Here's the funny part. Not so funny. We were not designed. We have not evolved to handle VUCA. The way our brains developed as Homo sapiens were developing, as this species was evolving, the thing that separated us and made us very different from other animals, including other members of the Homo genus, was that we had these very large brains, which were an advantage in a whole ton of different ways, but they also consume a huge amount of energy. In one of the newsletter articles this week, there's a factoid that these things, only our brains, okay, I'll stop saying these things. Our brains represent about 2% of our total body mass, all of everything else, 2%. But our brains consume 20% of our energy. And when I'm spending most of the day sitting in a chair working on a computer, that's not taking too much energy away. It's not like I need that energy for other things a whole lot. But for our ancestors, minimizing that energy drain was one of the most important things that enabled survival. And so we evolved to make all sorts of mental shortcuts. We don't like to come up with new ideas because that takes a whole lot of that mental energy. And for our ancestors, that might make the difference between whether you can outrun the mastodon or the saber-toothed tiger or whatever, or not. The challenge we have today is that our brains are such that we kick back to old assumptions We fall back on our rules of thumb, our assumptions, our kind of expectations of how the world works. And a lot of times we're not even aware that we're doing that because it's so deep inside our brains where we're making those assumptions. We're just jumping to that easy track that we've already done before. But if you're in a moment of VUCA, if you're in an era of VUCA, that might not help at all. So that's a huge challenge for all of us. And the process of changing those tracks, of rewiring our brains, of developing new thought patterns and new expectations, that's called neuroplasticity. And that Mind in the Brain book that I referenced before was really one of the best for talking about that issue. So what does that mean for us? It means that developing a future-ready mindset isn't just about saying we're going to do it. That doesn't work any better than saying, I'm going to go run 5 miles a day when I've never run before, or saying that I'm going to play basketball 3 times a week when I've never played basketball. Our neuroplasticity has to be engaged. And if it's not engaged, we're going to fall back into the same old patterns. What does that take? Changing our mindsets, developing that future-ready mind requires intentionality. It requires a lot of repetition. And that's one of the things, especially the older you get, the more repetition you need. And that's one of the things that the Mind and the Brain lays out so beautifully. But most importantly, perhaps, is that we need to embed what we do in a system of systems, in a context of external systems, organizational systems, community norms, community expectations, and let those systems sort of serve as our external framework, like one of those exoskeletons that allows a person who is paralyzed to take a step. If you haven't seen that, look it up. It's really pretty awesome. So we need to know what we want to do. We need to commit to doing it. And we need to have systems around us to do that. And one of the most important pieces of that system is having community, having people who are on the same, who are going through the same process that you are, because otherwise it can feel really lonely. Next week, we will be rolling out a new group coaching opportunity that I think will give a lot of you the framework that you may feel that you need. So all of that is more crucial today than it's ever been, because we're in a moment where we're going to have to change. We're going to have to change our mindset. And the sooner we do that, the easier it's going to be for us. And because so many of the challenges that we face, whether it's dissatisfied employees in our businesses, if it's lack of access to opportunities for our organizations, if it's the problems that plague communities of all types all over the world. We've been trying to solve a lot of these things for a long time, and the things that we've come up with so far aren't solving them. So we're going to have to create that new paradigm, those new expectations, those new systems. But we can't just do that by thinking about it and wishing that it would happen. So we can't really make real change in ourselves, in our organizations and businesses, or in our communities unless we have equipped ourselves to live and work effectively in a time period of change. And the rest of this month, we're going to be talking about how to do that and how to do that starting with ourselves. This is just going to scratch the surface. And if you want to learn more and if you want to stay engaged, definitely check out Future Here Now at wiseeconomy.substack.com. Because that, I think, will be a great help in feeding you some of the information and analysis and insight that will help you to build that future-ready mindset and the rest of the skills that we're going to need to manage in this VUCA era. I did have a few questions come in, so I'm gonna grab those real quick. The first one is really cool. Somebody said, how do I know if I need to work on my neuroplasticity? And I love that. And the answer is, you do. You do. Almost all of us, especially if we're sort of in that millennial age group or older, have really, and by come up, I mean like really grown up and learned and imbibed and developed those neural pathways around industrial era expectations. And to some extent or another, those are going to come into conflict with the situations that we encounter now and into the future. So chances are all of us need to work on our neuroplasticity. If you're younger, I believe the neuroscientists will tell you that the cutoff is somewhere around the late 20s, your late 20s, mid to late 20s. Before that, you're likely to be very neuroplastic. So it's much easier for you to take in new ideas and, rewire those expectations. The farther you get beyond that, it's doable, but it takes more work and more repetition and more intentionality and more support, which is part of why it's so important to work on this in our businesses and organizations and communities, because we're going to need that kind of level of societal support in order to make that transition. So the answer is probably yes. But you can start at any age. And you can pick it up at any age too. Two more questions. One is, what does this brain stuff have to do with work? Like, and I'm interpreting from what this person wrote, but you're talking about all this stuff in my head, and what I really need to do is solve problems in my office. Understood. This is the tool you've got to do that solving, right? It's if you're trying to solve problems in your organization, but you're using hand tools from the 19th century, from the 1800s, you're using a hammer, a saw, an adze, a pickaxe from a very long ago period, and you're using that because that's what you've got on hand. Chances are you might do as much damage as you do good. Because, again, the context has changed. Even though our organizations and businesses look basically the same on the surface, the undercurrents of what's going on have changed very, very, very profoundly. So we need new tools in order to do that. And one of the first new tools is to develop that future ready mindset, that future ready set of assumptions and expectations. What's the one best thing I can do to improve my neuroplasticity? That's the last question I have. And I think that's a great question. The best advice I have ever been able to give anybody, and this is what made the difference for me, is to work with people, get to know people, collaborate with people who are as different from yourself as you can get. Again, that runs at total crossways to what we have become accustomed to, which is I stick with people who look like me, who are my tribe, quote unquote. And it's nice and comfortable to be in my tribe because they have the same assumptions and expectations and etc. that I do. The way that you develop neuroplasticity, in my opinion, one of the most effective ways to start doing that is to learn from people who are very different from yourself. I think the best way to do that is through working with people in person. But if that's not available to you, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people online, on TikTok, on other social media, on YouTube, who will talk honestly about their experiences as someone who's different from you. Learn and listen to them, and listen to them with an open mind, not trying to critique what they're saying, but hearing what they're saying. For me, that has been the most effective way to change my mental wiring. And over the course of a couple of years of doing that, I learned to see the world and I learned to act in ways that were very, very different from what was available to me before. So connect to people who are as different from yourself as you can get. That's my best piece of advice. So thanks again for taking the time to be here with me today. This is a privilege, and it's something that I'm grateful to be able to do with you. If you want to learn more, again, Future Here Now, which is at wiseeconomy.substack.com. That's my newsletter that comes out 3 to 4 times a week. You want to be a paid subscriber to get the full benefit, but you can see an article for free. And when you sign up for a subscription, you get a week free to check it out. So I hope you'll join me there at wiseeconomy.substack.com. In addition to that, look for content, look for videos, look for white papers and other kinds of resources here and on other social media under either Della Rucker or Wise Economy. And I thank you again and look forward to talking to you next week. So let's go get them. Thanks.